This PowerPoint will talk about the scope and sequence for the APUS history classroom. I'm going to provide you three different models of how I've taught the classroom and how you might want to consider teaching your classroom. But one thing I will say right from the start that's very important. This is how I do things, and I'm very proud of the fact that I've done this in three different ways, and I'll tell you what's worked for me and what hasn't. In the end, you have to choose what model is going to work best for you, and it may be one of these three models, or you may have your own model. When I've gone to professional developments, one of the best pieces of advice that I was ever given was from the presenter saying, look, these are the talents and skills I bring to the table, and I hope this will help you with your classroom. But in the end, you know what's best for you and your students, and you need to do what's best for your way of teaching for your students. So all these are just models for you to consider, and hopefully one of these will help you out. If you want to adopt one completely, or if you want to adopt parts of them, great. But go with what's going to work best for you and your students, what brings out the passionate creativity that you have within your classroom. So, some overall important considerations to have no matter what, though, as you are planning out your APUS history class. First of all, you want to make sure you plan out the 9 major units that have to be taught within the framework. You want to make sure that you include a chronological sequence of the major historical thinking skills to teach to the students as well. So if you've tended to focus on the facts and the past, you really want to start switching around and focusing more on the historical thinking skills, because that's the way the national test is going to be done. So that includes comparison and contrast, cause and effect, periodization, synthesis, and context. Also, you want to make sure that you include time in whatever type of calendaring you do for tests, reviews, and school holidays. So the first model is chronological, and this was the way I taught the class for about the first 5 years that I taught the class. Most teachers, I think, do tend to teach chronologically, and there's an obvious upside for that. It really makes things a lot clearer for students about how one period moves into the next period. Here's how I would suggest doing it. Period 1 and Period 2 you can mix together. Remember, Period 1 is only 5% of the class. You could teach pre-Columbian and colonization within September. Period 3 you could teach in October. That's Revolution to the New Republic. Period 4, which is the antebellum years, you teach in November. Period 5, Civil War in December. Period 6, which includes the Industrial Revolution and American foreign policy or American imperialism within January. Period 7, Progressives, World Wars, and Cold War in February. Period 8, the Civil Rights, Vietnam War, and Countercultural Movement in March. And then Period 9, which again, we're back to that 5% last unit, which we will be going over this week about the content, and that's the New Right, the Reagan Revolution, Bush to Clinton, and Obama within April. And then you want to make sure you leave about 2 to 3 weeks so that you can go ahead and do a review for the national exam. Another model of teaching is teaching the class backwards, and I've been doing this now for about the last 6 years. I know when you hear this is probably freaking you out a little bit, and for good reason. You're probably wondering, wow, do you really teach from today's date and then going backwards all the way to the pre-Columbian time? No, and if that was what I was going to do, I'd be freaked out as well. I think the students would get really confused with that kind of a model. Instead, what I do is this. I start off with the 20th century, so that's periods 7 to 9, and I teach that from September to October. Now here are the upsides that I've found from this. The period after the Civil War, from 7 to 9, is very complicated, and there's so much going on and so many great themes that are going on. It tends to be this era of like quicksand for me if I teach it at the end of the year, and it's very hard for me to get to the national reviews. If I teach it at the beginning of the year, things tend to go more smoothly. I can go into depth a little bit more. The kids are more energetic because it's the beginning of the year, and I can introduce a lot of the historical thinking skills. Then what I do is I start from the beginning of the class after period 9, and I start to march forward. Now, here's the great thing about that. I now am able to make so many connections between the end game and what happens from the beginning on upwards. This is a great way, for example, to teach synthesis skills. So when I get up to November, I can mix together period 1 and 2, then period 3, Revolution to New Republic, period 4, Antebellum in January, period 5, Civil War to Reconstruction in February, period 6, Industrial Revolution, American foreign policy from March to April. And then I have those 2 to 3 weeks before the exam. What I have found from experience is that when I teach the class backwards in this way, I have more time for class reviews at the end of the year, and on top of that, I tend to be able to do a lot of those connections a little bit better because the kids can see what we're leading up to for the end of the class. In the last year, though, I've taught with a different model. It's called the thematic model. Now, this is not going to be for everybody. I'll say this right up front, but there's some really upsides to doing this, and I'll explain how it's worked. So what I've done is I have created themes along very much paralleling the College Board theme. So for example, theme 1 for me is American Identity, and I teach that in September. And here's what I do. I start off in the pre-Columbian time, and I go all the way through the class, all the way up to the time period of Obama. Now, you're probably wondering, wow, 3 to 4 weeks, how are you teaching the entire class in that time period? Well, I don't teach everything within the class in that time period, but I take snapshots from each one of the major time periods, and I teach about that surrounding the theme. Then I go to theme 2, American Economics and Trade, and I do the same thing. I start at the beginning of the class, pre-Columbian, and move all the way up to Obama with different snapshots from each period in October. Then theme 3, American Ideology, same idea in November. Theme 4, American Foreign Policy in December. Theme 5, Warfare and American Governance in January. Theme 6, Ethnic Movements and Gender in February. Theme 7, Political Party Developments in March. And then I finish off once again in April with review sessions for about 3 weeks in the class. Now, you're probably wondering, like what are the upsides and downsides of this? Well, I asked the students at the end of the year, I just started this with last year, and I asked the students how they liked it, and they said, theme 1, they were really confused. They didn't know what was going on because we were jumping all over the place. But when we got to theme 2 and onwards, they really understood it. They saw how there were connections between these different historical time periods and themes. And from there on out, it became sort of this jigsaw puzzle that they could piece together because now they could see how these themes and time periods work together. And that's the major thing that I wanted to get across to them in these thematic units, was for them to see the synthesis skill that's so important. So for a lot of teachers, they won't teach synthesis until the end of the first semester or beginning of the second semester because there's just not enough information. For me, I can teach synthesis skills really by the time I get done with theme 2. We're in the synthesis skills because the kids have so much information. In fact, this last year when I did this, when I finished up November, there was a part of me that almost felt like I was done with the class at that point because I had taught the kids now 3 different times the overall pattern of what happened in American history. I felt like they already had enough information to possibly sit down and take most of the AP tests. Now, obviously, they needed a lot more information from foreign policy to governance and ethnic movements, but what I found that was really as an upside to this model is that it really gave them the frameworks for each time periods very rapidly. So some important considerations. Like I said at the beginning, what's important is that you've got to choose a method that works best for you and your students, whether that's chronological, if it's backwards, if it's thematic, or something else. You've got to choose what you know works well for your students. These types of methods have worked well for my teaching style. Hopefully there's something out of this that you can take that will help you in your classroom, but in the end, you're going to choose what you are best at, and you should feel proud and confident to go forward doing that. But there are some things that you want to keep in mind that all teachers have to include. You have to include the thinking skills, the themes, and the connections. You want to make sure that you chronologically or in a very clear pattern introduce the new skills that the kids are going to need and that you have time to practice those skills. And the new skill synthesis is going to be really important because you want students to be able to make those connections across time periods. The other thing to keep in mind as you're doing your planning are those pesky school things that seem to get in the way of our teaching. So this is one of the big problems for me every single year is as I'm sitting down, I'm doing my big calendaring items, I always have to look out for those things that could get in the way of how best I can teach the students. Those include things like holidays, breaks, student assemblies, differing period rotations. I teach at a Catholic school, so we have Mass days, and I've got to make sure that those are planned in so that I know that I've got to work around those times when we seem to get out of the classroom doing other things. You want to make sure you include time for test reviews at the end of the year. About 2 to 3 weeks would be really good to make sure that the students have a chance to go back over the information and make the connections they need to make. And for me, it's really important that I include in the days of the test I want to give and the reviews after the test. Usually for me, I take about 15-20 minutes after I pass back a test to go over the patterns where students might have struggled a little bit in the class. I've got to make sure that that's planned in so that I know how much time I have really to teach the content. One of the solutions to all this might be that flipped classroom model that we talked about earlier on in the class. Flipped classroom model would allow you, when you're doing a lot of these things and you don't have a lot of time, to have some of the information the students do at home through videos, and then as soon as you're done with the things you have to do inside the class or outside of class, they can jump right into discussions off the work they've already done. And that brings up that big concept that we've all been learning in schools nowadays, and that's backwards mapping. So start off with the date of the national test as you're doing your calendaring. Give yourself 2 to 3 weeks for the test review. Then input the units however you teach them, whether it's chronological with the periods, if it's backwards map, if it's a backwards type of teaching, or if it's thematic or another way of doing it. Then as soon as you're done putting in the units, now go forward and start asking, okay, what are the skills I want to teach and how am I going to teach them to make sure the students understand all this? And one suggested schedule that I would give would be to start off with context. So happy analysis, that's historical context, audience, point of view, and purpose. Move to cause and effect, then comparison and contrast, and then possibly use synthesis at the end of the first semester or beginning of second semester. So some takeaways. Choose the model that's going to work best for your classroom. Whether that is chronological, if it's backwards teaching, if it's thematic or something else, you've got to choose the one that works best for your students, and you know you can teach well as your students can understand it well. Then set up your course by backwards mapping. Use the national exam and test reviews as a place to start. Input your units. And then make sure, no matter what, you've got to set up your curriculum in a way that introduces the historical thinking skills, because that really has become the most important part of this class.